This episode is brought to you by Encore Business Group, Eric Hall Aesthetic and General Dentistry, Williams Chiropractic, Elite Winning Solutions, and Sal's Complete Home Painting and Handyman Services. Shayne grabs extra points with Ron Walsh airs live Thursdays, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern on Jethro.fm.
You know, in the pro sports world, that everybody just parties and drinks and goes crazy, you know. It's really not like that. You know, I'm not going to say I never went out and had some wine with dinner or maybe even had some drinks with friends at times. But for the most part during the season, during the week, really wasn't a ton of drinking, and maybe the night after the game. But there were never drinking games like that. I don't think that drinking games are I think they're frowned upon in public establishments. They don't want you to play drinking games because they're technically not allowed to overserve, and it tends to lead to overserve.
Right. That makes sense. Well, yeah, I get what you're saying, because the NFL is so regimented that, like, I mean, there are those rumors. It's like, oh, when teams go down to Miami, or now that like Vegas is in play, you know, there's different splits that you can read where teams don't. That's happening in hockey right now, where teams go into Vegas and having a day off before they play against the Vegas Knights. That's not going so well. And there's a lot of things that could be playing in. You got time zone things. They're not necessarily drinking, but that's basically like adult Disneyland. So you can be doing all the things, whatever you want to be doing there in Vegas. But I know there's different markets that have different splits, because Miami used to famously be that, I think more so for basketball, but where once you travel down to Miami and maybe you went to South Beach and indulge. But I feel like that's the hardest to do in specifically football, because you guys are so regimented and you're working your bodies so hard that it's like by the time you're done with practice and done with your routine for the day, you got to be wanting water and more restoration oriented things to hydrate you, rather than, you know, pounding down a bunch of beers or something that's going to dehydrate you.
Well, especially like right after practice, no one's thinking about alcohol at that point. I can promise you that. But the limitations we have when we traveled is we only traveled one day a week. Basketball, hockey, some of the baseball, they kind of go on like road stands, you know, so they're going to go out for 5 days, and they're going to be in the same city for quite a few days because they might have a series or they might have whatever. Football, if we played on Sunday, we traveled on Saturday. Our time was micromanaged. We were handed itineraries. Hey, team meetings at 7 or dinners at 7, or here's your per diem to go to dinner, but you got to come back because the team meeting's at 8, and then special teams meetings at 8:45, and then offense and defense is from 9 to 9:30, and then we have snack, and then you're in curfew in your room, and they have a security guard on that level where the elevators are, so you can't even have guests on your floor. So it's a very regimented, almost authoritarian type atmosphere when you travel, and immediately after the game, you're on the bus to the airport and you go right home.
Was there any variation to that with the different teams you were on, or was that pretty much the NFL standard when you were playing?
It was almost a standard.
Okay.
Some teams would have a dinner provided, like in the ballroom, and they'd have like a big buffet. Some teams would say, here's $150. You've got an hour and a half for dinner. Be back.
Okay.
And that was kind of how it was set up.
Interesting. Yeah, I knew that there was curfew and stuff, but that is more, as to use your word, authoritarian than I would have imagined. But they're doing that for a reason, obviously, because those subtle differences of if you're a little bit more tired, if your muscles are tired, if you didn't get a proper amount of sleep, even if you're not, it's not like you said, it's not even that people are going out and drinking. Maybe they're just having a nice dinner. Maybe they want a longer dinner. They're having a steak. They're not really drinking much or anything, but they can still stay out too late and then throw off their sleep cycle. Absolutely. And not necessarily have the same amount of energy, because that's always something that fascinates me about sports, is kind of those micro adjustments, those micro things that happen that build into bigger things. Being thrown off your schedule by 30 minutes could throw off your entire next day, or whatever happens, especially when you're talking about any of the positions. A kicker is a great example, because if you miss the ball by just a little bit, then it's not going as far, or it's cutting left, cutting right, whatever it is, and those can compound. So when people might say, well, that's pretty strict, it's like, but yeah, when you're playing, it is a game of inches, famously.
It's very routine driven, and I can tell you a high percentage of the teams, when we would travel, they would say, don't change your watch. stick to the same time zone.
Interesting.
So that we go to bed the same time. Just because the hours, earlier or whatever, we're not using that hour. We're going to still go to sleep at that time so your circadian rhythm can stay the same. So when you wake up, you might have a little extra time the next day but if you think about how the NFL schedule is put together, it's all based off the Eastern Standard Time anyway. So really, we just stick to that. And if it's a 1 o'clock East Coast game and we're playing one time zone over, we're still 12 o'clock on that time zone, but we're still thinking of it as 1 o'clock.
Okay, interesting. So you'd even do that for the West Coast games when you were 3 hours
West
behind?
Coast, we would. Those somewhat were a little different. We didn't have a ton of those because I never played in a division that went out there a ton. But when we did, we would sometimes go on Friday, but we would still have like a structured team gathering, of some sort when we got there. We still had curfew. We still had certain things. We just had a little bit more free time. And then during the day on Saturday, we would get on the buses and go to the stadium, have a walkthrough on the field, and then everything is kind of regimented after that as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, the time zone thing has interested me because specifically since we live in Big Ten land, now that the Big Ten has expanded to including teams like USC and UCLA, that's become a big, I know. I don't know what to do with that. Whenever I type that out on any of our social media when I'm promoting that we're talking about the Big Ten for the show, I always put so that it spells Big 18 total because that's what it is.
Yeah.
And it's all across. They show that map where it's all across the U.S. and it's got all those West Coast teams. But that's really affecting these guys, especially young guys who don't have these rhythms. You're trying to help them through your school and everything and your coaching program. But it's like this is why you talked about in a previous interview that you coach people on how to pack their bag and do all these things because that is clearly important because the records against the spread when the teams from the Midwest or the East Coast, say a Penn State, has to travel to USC or Oregon or UCLA, the record against the spread is terrible. It's like the most bettable game there is, and it's basically just because of the time zone that they're just not the same team.
Well, imagine the West Coast. Who's the West Coast? Is it Cal? Is it UCLA? Who's in the ACC? Somebody's in the Atlantic Coast Conference who is literally perched on the Pacific Coast.
Right.
And it's almost like these P4 conferences in today's world, it's gotten lost because there used to be and maybe the SEC still has this, but this very strong like regional pride in your conference, and I think the SEC is almost cultish about it, because it just means more in the SEC. It's kind of their whole mantra is Southern football, Southern,
right.
Southern. And now you're seeing these conferences or super conferences that are getting built up, and it's like the names don't even match up to what the conferences are. Big 10, Big 12.
Oh yeah.
Like how many actually is it?
Exactly. And it is Cal. It's Cal Berkeley that we have in the ACC, which is wild. Their splits I'm going to have to look at this during the break, and we're going to talk some more college football because I wanted to talk more about Belichick, who they did play Cal, it looked like, on October 17th, but wanted to talk more about that. But wanted to talk more about that later in the show because we're having an interesting conversation about him, and I'm sure we could spend a whole show on him too, but we'll talk about him more later. But I want to pick up that conversation here a little bit later in the show. We're gonna transition to a break, and then we're gonna talk to John Whiticar of Pride of Detroit about the upcoming Lions game and his thoughts on the Lions so far this season because we haven't had him on yet, and then talk about their Movember charity campaign. You're listening to Extra Points on Jethro FM. Stick with us. We're happy to bring on this next guest here. He's our Detroit beat writer that covers things from the land of Manu here. We've got to get the report from Canada here from John Whiticar of Pride of Detroit. Curious what he thinks about the team so far and what's going on here. But so we usually do a food thing of the day, but we didn't really have anything to work with here, John. So I'm curious if you have a favorite music style. It's Symphonic Metal Day, and I had to get Jeff Risden on for that one because he's the only metal guy that I know of in the Lions beat. But I'm curious what you listen to.
Oh, I'm not too well versed in new stuff. I got to say, I'm an old school at heart, so
things like classic rock are always up my alley. A few years back when the Lions were kind of toting the Toto Africa, that was kind of in my wheelhouse. So that's usually where you're going to find me listening to, or at concerts and whatnot.
Nice. That's kind of my wheelhouse as well. We're on a country station, so we have to push that as well. But I'm more in the metal and rock and classic rock area here, and that's what we're talking about with Shayne, who's on with us here, Shayne Graham. And so we're excited to talk with you. Curious about your thoughts here. The big discussion, obviously, this week, which has kind of been the head of the news cycle here, is the play calling change. And I want to figure out where we should stand on it. We were talking about it some last week, but people are kind of comparing it to the Anthony Lynn thing, and obviously it's a little bit of a different situation, but I'm curious how you saw that change. Obviously it went well, but I'm curious your take on it here.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting point for the Lions going forward. Again, the Anthony Lynn comparison is really accurate, but also there are some differences because back when that happened in 2021, Dan Campbell, his first year as an official head coach, he was still kind of learning the ins and outs about what he wanted from his team's identity. And I think at the end of the day, he soon found that Lynn wasn't really that guy. The difference this year with Morton is I think the organization still really likes him. And I think they like having his voice in the locker room, in the game plan study room. All of that, I think, points to him still being a big part of the offense going forward, even if he isn't calling the plays for the next week, for the next month, maybe for the year. He responded pretty well to it, and his mentality, I think, is top-notch for what you're looking for, because he was saying things like, I'll do whatever it takes to win. And he's not viewing it as a demotion or a firing. He's viewing it as the Lions are shaking something up to hopefully kickstart something better. And we saw that against the Washington Commanders. I think the offense looked as good as they had looked in probably a month. But the big question is this sustainable? Because looking at next week's game, it's going to be against the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, they maybe haven't been at the top of their form, but it's the Philadelphia Eagles. They're a talented roster. They have a recent track record of success. That's not a team that's going to be an easy pushover. So if the Lions perform well in that game, then I think you say, hey, Dan Campbell calling plays, good change. We progress with that going forward. If not, maybe you say, well, what are some of the changes we can do going forward that isn't necessarily how you're calling the plays, but the plays themselves to get your star players actually working in space and give them the best chance to succeed?
It seems to me a big part of this is Dan Campbell for a blocking tight end and a guy that doesn't necessarily have the reputation of being one of these football geniuses, although I think he should probably be starting to get that. He understands game flow really well, but I'm curious where you stand on this, Shayne, because you've had different coaches. We mentioned Belichick before the break. He famously liked to call a lot of the things, and once you got down to the coordinators, you didn't really know what they were doing on the team. Like, they were managing things, but they weren't necessarily the primary play callers. And then once they got to other teams, famously with the defense as head coaches, Romeo Crennel, or that we had Patricia here that moved here and then didn't really seem well prepared for. Big G's happy about the Patricia reference here, but he didn't really seem well prepared. But I'm curious where you stand on this, and if you saw a lot of differences between those different iterations of having an offensive coordinator call the plays versus one of your head coaches.
Well, I think it's really important to remember that just because the offensive coordinator may have the keys taken away on game day, they still drove the car all week long. They're the ones that designed the plays. They're the ones that came up with a lot of the scheme that they're using. Now, they may have done it in coordination with the head coach, but that offensive coordinator is the guy that was putting those plays together to fit the game plan. And when they're called individually during the game, may or may not be all that different because they're both looking at the same things. They're both seeing the coverages. They're both seeing weaknesses. They're both seeing certain things. But that head coach, that's why they have that coordinator, is so that they can build those things together, because some coordinators are going to be able to actually understand, okay, if we use these route concepts against, this defensive front or this, secondary, we're going to be able to take advantage of this or that. And the head coach is going to be on the same page with that, but they're also both understanding situational awarenesses and tendencies and things like that. It's just the head coach might have a little bit more freedom to kind of, let some things go that the coordinator may or may not, because they're thinking about, well, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to piss the head coach. Whatever thoughts may be happening, the head coach answers to himself, and he knows, like, I don't have anything to lose, so I'm going to call this play because I think this play is going to work. You just better get it off before that 15-second cutoff.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of the unabridged nature of, if you're a head coach, yeah, you don't really have to. I mean, as long Campbell's obviously not on the chopping block, he's not anywhere near it, so he's got a little bit of room to take that over, and nobody's really going to criticize him if he can't necessarily call plays in addition to his great management of the team and the culture. He'll just go back to that, and then hopefully Morton will learn from this too, because that was a point that was brought up last week that I think Jeremy Reisman brought it up, that when Ben Johnson was there, he got to learn under Campbell for a while, get his feel for how he would call a game. Now Morton can see that for however many games it is. I'm not sure how much this was happening when you were playing, Shayne. Are we making too much of the whole the sight, the eye line for the game being up in the box versus on the field?
It's funny. A lot of coordinators have different opinions on that. Some guys like to see it from a bird's eye view. Some guys like to see it right there on the field. I think we can all be different in our preferences, because I think when I think about certain things in my life that I've been good at or bad at, there's other people who are good or better or worse or however. But maybe those people that might have been better at it might have been better from a different perspective than the way I was looking at it. So I think we have to kind of, what's your comfort level? Some coaches like to see the macro. They like to see, everybody all spread out over top of the field, see what the coverages looks like as a whole. Whereas some coaches like to see it kind of in that two-dimensional plane from the field level, where they can see things play out and they might see details that they might not see up in the box, and that's where it plays in is instinctual decisions versus purely logistical decisions.
I do think that was an advantage of Campbell taking over, but still involving Morton, because he was still up top and was probably filtering in comments and seeing that different view.
And they're in each other's headphones. I promise you, they're having a conversation, and that's honestly why sometimes there could be a little delay in playing that, because maybe they're debating something. I mean, if you think of, I think about every field goal I ever kicked in my career that was beyond 50 yards. Almost always, you'll notice that we're sent out onto the field late because the coaches are like, "Should we go for it? Should we go for it? Kick it." And that conversation in the headset can sometimes create a delay in that. And then all of a sudden you got to spit it out to your quarterback through the speaker when there's a time limit on when you're allowed to put that out. That's when it plays into it.
That's so tight. It's amazing how quickly they can make those decisions. One of the key parts of Campbell taking over was maybe involving Jameson Williams a little bit more. And John, I got to give you credit on this, because in September you were tweeting about, hey, we got to get J-Mo more involved and get him in these intermediate routes, and that's clearly what Campbell saw, and I feel like that changed the game a lot, and just getting J-Mo involved. This is a difference. We're going to talk about this a little bit with Glenn Erby when we have him on later, of Eagles Wire, but I feel like Philadelphia and Detroit are kind of opposite in this sense. J-Mo has not kicked up any dust about not necessarily being involved quite as much, and A.J. Brown is always making trouble over there, and they're kind of going talent over culture, and Lions are going culture over talent, a mixture of both, of course, but that was clearly the key, and you were calling for that in September here, John.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned the clash between the Eagles and Lions, and kind of coming back to the whole issue with John Morton is that even though he got demoted, his role got changed. There's no complaining. It's all about the team first, team first, team first. And we see a similar thing with the Lions offense. Like, look at guys like St. Brown and J-Mo. When they're not getting the ball, they're blocking their butts off, right? guys like Jared Goff, like this dude is an absolute trooper and one of the toughest SOBs out there. And you look at what this team is and the mentality that they built over the course of having Dan Campbell is that they're not a selfish team. They are going to do whatever it takes to win. And whether that's running vertical routes downfield and trying to air it out for JMO, whether that's fighting underneath, trying to get open in the slot, whether it's blocking for your running backs, whether it's a guy like Panay Sewell, who suffers what looks like a pretty bad injury, pops up a few plays later, and he's mowing down defensive tackles and cornerbacks as he's pulling. Like, these are guys who are so dedicated to the craft, and they're so dedicated to the guys around them that I think it elevates them well beyond what their talent level may or may not be. Now, I think a guy like General Manager Brad Holmes has done an excellent job of cultivating that talent, but it's really just a perfect recipe of a coaching staff being able to get everyone to buy in to what they want to be.
It's a great point, and it's what you referenced it earlier, John, but it's what Morton's doing in this situation too. He's being a culture guy and saying, hey, I'm trying to do the best thing for the team. I'm still working, to Shayne's point. I'm still putting together things. I'm still working the other 6 days of the week. Just because I'm not calling plays doesn't mean I'm not involved, because that's one of the things we try to highlight on the show, that these are entire staffs. These aren't just 3 guys, a head coach and 2 coordinators. So it's a good conversation, but we'll return to it here after the break. Stick with us. You're listening to Extra Points on Jethro FM. Coming back here with John Whiticar of Pride of Detroit. I was looking at your article, John, about the winners and losers of last week, and obviously there was a lot of winners in that Washington game, but I want to highlight one of the losers, not to focus on the negative part, but I do think there's an injury component to this with Aleem McNeil, because he's struggling. He's one of my favorite players on the team. He's great for that pass rush and run defense alike, but we talk about this a lot on the show because we have Jimmy Liao on the show, and now with Shayne here, we're talking about the nuances of football and having to deal with injuries, because fans don't always like to hear it, but these are real things. And just, we were talking about kind of the minor things being able to throw you off. An injury is more than a minor thing that can throw you off. So I'm curious if that's what you're kind of seeing here with Aleem, John.
And whenever you come back from such a significant injury as what he had last year, it's going to take time to get reaccustomed to everything. I mean, this is a guy who missed training camp. And when you look at the offensive line, for example, that's where these very important bonds and chemistry are made. And all of a sudden, if a guy's out for most of that time, it hurts. And you see the same thing along the defensive line. Now, you don't think about a defensive line having cohesion like an offensive line, but how these guys interact with each other, a guy like Hutchinson on the edge, how he can free up interior and other players. That's a big part of what makes a good defensive line successful. And I think right now for McNeil, I don't think he's lost the step. I still think you see those flashes of the prime McNeil we saw last year. But it's really just, I think it's going to take a few more weeks for him to get back into rhythm. I think in the run game, normally what is one of his strengths, I think he's been washed out maybe a few too many times, but he still has so much talent that I'm really not concerned at this point. The other nice thing is that the Lions are getting production from other guys on the roster. Obviously, a veteran like DJ Reader is great to have. I think we would all kind of agree we would like to see a bit more of Tyleik Williams out there, but they're also in a situation where they don't need to rush him either. Because then all of a sudden you have a guy like Roy Lopez, who last week Dan Campbell was gushing about. Now, this is a guy who is, I think, probably their second or third string nose tackle on the roster. How many times is an offensive head coach going to be gushing about a player like that? So it really makes you realize that, sure, I think McNeil hasn't really had the start to the season that we've looked for, but we also don't need him to be 100% right off the bat, because I think we have enough talent on the defensive line to facilitate him kind of slowly getting better and better and better. Now, that being said, I do want to see that in the next few weeks, but I'm not panicking just quite yet with his performance.
Especially because he's essentially going through his version of training camp, but into the fire. He's straight from the frying pan into the fire. I feel like you can relate to this well, Shayne, because we were talking about just the routine of the week to week getting screwed up. This is a guy that missed all of training camp. He was recovering from an injury, and now they're saying, okay, go push around 300-pound guards here, and don't show any any history of your injury or anything that you're ailing or anything like that?
Well, one of the biggest things you have to build, whether you're injured or not, is confidence in your ability. And when you're injured, you don't get those repetitions. So it doesn't matter if a defensive lineman is, their main move is a bull rush and their counter to that is a scissor move or a spin move or whatever their counter is to their main technique. If you don't have a chance to practice it in live reps, you're never really going to be that great at it, because you always have to. I mean, that was what Kobe Bryant was always like, the basics. I want to be so good at the basics that everything else falls into place. So when these guys miss that time, they've got to somewhat build it back, and you have some instincts, you have some, innate ability that you've always had, but you have to rep those things in order to have the confidence to do it the level that you're used to. And then you throw in, if you're not getting those reps when you come back, are they going to limit your reps to keep you from getting hurt more? And we can, I'm sure, talk about this at some point, but there's less contact now in practice than there used to be because the pad rules and the concussions and all that. And I think that's playing into the injury counts that we're seeing. Is less live repetitions of full contact means when you get in a game, you're seeing contact that you don't really get to see that much. And when you talk about a guy who's coming off an injury, he doesn't get any of that. And it's almost like go out into the fire and see how hot it is when you didn't get a chance to put your toe in the water during the week.
Yeah, he's the crab in the pot that doesn't know the water's boiling yet. Well, that's interesting. I do have that on our list to discuss at some point, not necessarily the show, although we can talk about it later in the show. But I was curious about the other side of this, because the Lions do have a lot of injuries and they notoriously do practice very hard. Campbell has them going very hard. We see fights during OTAs and training camp and all of that, and mini camp, and they do go very hard. But that's curious to look at it the other way, to say, well, wait a minute, maybe that even though you are going hard, maybe it's that, well, you're not getting that as much, so then you're accelerating for those plays, which you're risking injury on those plays, and then you're also not necessarily getting those consistent reps to see how to read and react to all the things that can happen in a football game.
Yeah, well, the NFLPA actually puts limits on how much contact you're allowed to have and how many days you're allowed to wear full pads. And you can say we go hard in practice. I can promise you every head coach is going to say we go hard in practice, right? The way we do it here, like everyone's going to say that. And everyone wants to claim that they're that blue collar, hardworking team. But it's really hard when you compare it to just 15 years ago and 20 years ago, when it was full two-a-days and when you had, full padded practices for a certain amount of times. You just don't see that as much, no matter how hard the coach wants to go. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a limiting factor, but also are the guys, and that's what's probably what works well for Detroit. You talk about culture. You can have a winning culture, but winning cultures do not sustain. You can win, you're a flash in the pan. A successful culture is a culture that endures and that creates everyone wanting to be on the same bus, and you're all going the same direction, but also knowing where is my seat on that bus, and I'm going to sit in the right seat and know my role. And I think that's where you talk about the offensive coordinator kind of taking a little bit of a back seat. He knew his role, and during that week he still did everything within his role, and he's going to continue to do it. But the players themselves, they have to understand, if we're going harder than most teams, I want to buy in. So I'm believing and I have conviction in why I'm going harder in practice, because that's the culture we have here, and I have to buy into it, or else I'm going to be resentful every day when I lay my head down at night. And you'll never have a team that's truly successful if you have players that have that stench of the fester of resentment going around that locker room.
I feel like that's a perfect way to describe the upcoming matchup because I've been trying to think about this. It's obviously two of the top NFC teams, but they're built very differently. You got the defending champions, and it's hard to say that that's a winning culture for sure. Though, like you're saying, Shayne, that's a team that's a defending champions, but they always seem a little bit like a house of cards to me, where their talent has to be so high to kind of overcome some of those things that you're talking about. Whereas the Lions, they've repurposed a lot of these guys. John, you mentioned Roy Lopez. There's a countless guys that you can kind of focus on where they're not going out and necessarily getting the Saquon Barkleys of the world. They're getting people that fit their culture. They're going after David Montgomery. They're doing those things. So I'm curious what you see, John, for this game and what you see as kind of the keys to the game for the upcoming matchup with Philadelphia here.
Yeah, I think the key to the game is going to be the reason why they beat Washington last week, and I think it's going to be getting that run game going. The identity of this team for the past few years has been basically running it down the throat of the defense. And in the weeks before against Tampa and the Vikings, we weren't really seeing all that successful run game. And I think the Lions were in a bit of a tough spot. I think having to replace their interior, obviously losing Frank Ragnow was big. Bringing in a guy like Mahogany, who only had 2 career starts to his name, and then bringing in Ratledge from the draft, there was a lot that could go wrong. And I think going into the season, they weren't really at that level yet. But what they showed against the Commanders, they were dominant, I would say, moving the blockers downfield, being able to get their guys space. And you know what happens when they're able to run the ball with Jahmyr Gibbs, with David Montgomery? It opens up everything downfield. That's when you have St. Brown working the interior. That's when JMO can take off either downfield or, guess what, they're introducing intermediate routes for him. And not to forget Sam Laporta. He's always a key part of the offense, whether he's a safety net or just a big playmaker. That's really the mentality for the Lions, is you need to be able to run the ball efficiently. And I think one of the key criticisms for John Morton when he was calling the plays is I think he wasn't facilitating a successful run game. I think there were a lot of very predictable plays like running on 3rd and long or screens on 3rd and long, and it just wasn't cohesive. And I think now what we saw against the Commanders was the blocking up front looked very in sync. And if we can get a similar level of success against the Eagles, I think all of a sudden we're looking pretty good.
It's funny because we can see this as fans and people that cover the team, but I feel like Ben Johnson was even guilty of this, even though he had a very successful play calling career for the Lions and obviously earned his head coaching job with the Bears. I feel like he was guilty of this a little bit on the games that didn't go so well for him either. We know that the offensive line drives everything and then drives the running game, which that drives everything else. And it's just interesting to see, but I think just like he maybe needed the adjustment, I think Morton probably also needs that same adjustment. And like you said, John, they have a little bit of an embarrassment of riches. You got to Laporta at the end, and then you didn't even mention, one of the guys, because he is later than all those other guys that you named, but you got a guy like Khalif Raymond who can get involved, and he's keeping the local talent Isaac Tesla off the field because Isaac's going to be used in a different format and he's still learning the offense. So that's the other part of this, is you are still trying to get everybody involved, even though they're not demanding the ball. You still want to try to have the reps be somewhat even and try to feed everybody as much as you can.
Yeah, exactly. And I think probably one of the reasons why the Lions were struggling for a bit on offense is that it wasn't just the right call at the right time. And it's kind of like playing rock, paper, scissors. You can win with every single hand, but you're not going to win all the time if you call the same thing. And I think with Morton, one of the reasons why him stepping back and maybe handing the reins over to Dan Campbell can help is that you're not focused on making the right play call at the right time. Instead, you serve up a platter of great plays to Campbell and let him kind of cherry pick what works and what doesn't. And sometimes it's really just about the feel for the game flow. As we mentioned earlier, Dan Campbell, I think he has a really underappreciated understanding of how a game is going. And I think when he was hired, a lot of people kind of viewed him as a bit of a meathead coach, more of a personality hire, rah-rah guy. But he's really a smart cookie. I think he really does not get enough credit for his game planning. And I think when you're able to get someone like him mixed in with a veteran like Morton, even regardless of who's calling the plays, I think if they can figure out what plays are the best at the right opportunity against the Eagles, that's how you capitalize it. Because we've seen very successful screenplays, but we've also seen them blown up in the worst possible ways. And sometimes it's just about throwing the right hand at the right time. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Lions really looked outclassed against the Vikings the other week, is that Brian Flores just pitched a masterclass.
We've talked a lot about kind of the smarts of Dan Campbell on the show, because I want to talk about this more with Shayne later, but it's like we make everybody one thing. He can't be big and tough and a blocking tight end and also smart. You can't be more than, everybody's more than one thing, but it's like we have to understand it better in our own brains, and so then we don't necessarily expand the possibilities. But great stuff, John, as usual. Appreciate you joining the show. Make sure to tell people where they can find you, and also highlight the Movember campaign for us too.
Yeah, so I currently write for Pride of Detroit. We are a branch under SB Nation that covers the Detroit Lions. We're posting articles every day. We got a few guys in the locker room getting quotes and other comments from players, coaches, and whatnot. But yeah, November is a very important month for us. It's when we are doing our Movember charity campaign. So for reference, we've been doing this for, I believe, 5 years now. And it is raising money for the University of Michigan Health Rojo Cancer Center. And a lot of people throughout the entire world have been impacted by cancer. For example, Jeremy lost his father a few years back. I've had an uncle who's been suffering from cancer for the past probably 4 or 5 years. And all the money that's being raised for this goes towards that kind of men's charity for cancer research fund. So we have a few incentives. We have a few auctions. We have giveaway prizes coming up. Some of our incentives, if we hit my personal favorite of $75,000 raised, is Jeremy Reisman, our editing manager. He will shave his head, and he is deathly afraid of that because he's not sure it will come back. So hopefully we can make his day a little bit worse by making the day a bit better for all these charities out there. Yeah, you can find more information on the Pride of Detroit homepage. We got a link posted at the very top. And we'd appreciate any sort of donation. Hopefully we can do our best to raise money for a very, very unfortunate situation for a lot of people out there.
It's a great cause, and they have a lot of fun ways to kind of donate and thank you for donating, because it is a very tough cause and it affects everybody, like John said, and so they've kind of tried to gamify it a little bit and have these different challenges. And yeah, that we talked to Jeremy a little bit last week about it. So we'll see. We'll be checking in with you guys, and we'll have more Pride of Detroit coverage here the rest of the month. But appreciate you joining us, and we'll look forward to you joining later in the season here, hopefully.
Thanks. I appreciate it. All the best to you guys. All
right. Thanks, John. Take care. Thanks to John Whiticar. Appreciate him joining us. We're going to continue the conversation here with Shayne. We got Glenn Erby coming on at 8 o'clock, but I want to talk to him about kind of that culture versus talent thing that we were talking about. And I also am curious if he's had any experiences in Philadelphia, because that's notoriously a tough place to play with that fan base here. So stick with us. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. Yeah, Shayne, I was curious about this because we talked about this. We did a little bit. Obviously, we focus on the local sports for the most part, but we wanted to do a Super Bowl preview. So we talked about this when we talked about the Eagles and the Chiefs, that there were kind of two different themes there. It seemed like everything with the Chiefs was very Taylor Swift oriented because she brings a lot of attention to the game. And then with the Eagles, it just makes me think of all these things. I heard Big G mention it when I was walking out of the studio, but they booed Santa Claus. They've thrown. I think they've thrown snowballs at Santa Claus too. They've thrown batteries at players. This is not exclusive to that city. There's good and bad fans in every city. But I'm curious if you have any Philadelphia stories, or if there's a certain city that sticks out to you playing in where it's like, this is going to be kind of a rough day as an opposing kicker that's on the sideline a lot and hearing from fans.
Yeah, so on the sidelines, I heard things from fans nonstop, all away games, because I was right there in the net, kind of right close to the edge of the bleachers. So I kind of became immune to that, and so every now and then they could actually be funny, and it was actually entertaining, and sometimes they would actually be really supportive. It was really weird. Because of the fantasy football thing, that sometimes played into it. But if I'm looking at a memory in Philadelphia, it would be the 2013 season. I was the kicker for the Saints, and we played Philadelphia in the playoffs. And it was the first time the Saints were going to play or had not won an outdoor game under a certain temperature in the playoffs, blah, blah, blah. I ended up kicking 4 field goals and a game winner on the last play of the game to advance to the next round. And it was kind of a big deal because, they're like, oh, they're not going to beat them in Philadelphia, in the cold weather, all of that. But our head coach decided to put bullseyes on the side of our bus because I guess there's a tendency for fans to throw things at the opposing team's bus.
Okay.
So not only did he put a bullseye on the side of the bus, he told the bus to take an extra lap around the parking lot through the tailgates to egg them on. So you can imagine how fun that was to have things banging up against the side of the bus because we had this vinyl bullseye, vinyl wrapped on the side of our bus.
Well, I'm curious. Okay, so you said egged them on. I'm curious what the actual items were that people were throwing. I can't imagine they probably had access to eggs. People probably weren't carrying eggs. That's why they had the batteries because it was like an insert in one of the giveaways, and so they were throwing those batteries the one game. But what were they throwing at the bullseyes here?
The thing you're going to see the most are the beer bottles, the airplane bottles of liquor. You'd hate to see them actually throw a pint or a fifth or something like that because that could potentially bust a window. But, we had, full cups of beer, beer bottles and little bottles, I'm sure batteries, footballs that the kids were playing with in the parking lot, pieces of pizza, hot dogs, you name it, it was thrown against that bus. And I think Sean Payton did it just to quote unquote egg them on a little bit.
I was thinking that was a Sean Payton move. Big G, you're a big wrestling fan. That makes me think of the old days of the WCW and NWO where they were just cascading the ring with sodas and food and all of that.
Oh yeah, when Hulk Hogan had his heel turn, that was you've never seen as much thrown into a ring. It was crazy.
Sean Payton probably is a wrestling fan. I feel like he's got the temperament for it.
He seems like a guy that probably could. Yeah.
That's interesting though that he because that's not a fan base that I get it because it's a big victory. I don't know if that's the fan base I would want to provoke. It's like, okay, we got everybody out of here healthy. We didn't have any equipment damaged. We didn't have any players damaged because that's been a threat at times with these the batteries and the different things that have been thrown. I mean, you can get injured on the sidelines there. So, but he was, I guess, once you guys were in the bus, he said, okay, this bus is fortified. Hopefully it was fortified for those items there.
Well, if you think about it, it's almost like you have a lot of keyboard warriors that talk real tough on the internet because they're protected by, fiber optics and miles and miles of separation. I think the head coach probably thinks we've got a police escort. We've got all these, biker cops beside of us. We've got all the other, police cars clearing the traffic. They're not going to get too crazy. I guess we got lucky because we didn't have anything shatter a window.
Well, and you do have, because that's a good point about you got keyboard warriors, you got people that are big behind a screen or whatever, but you got to be careful if you're a fan, but it's a weird dynamic because it's like, the guys on that team, whether you're talking about the linemen that could come off that bus and squash all these fans that are out there that are drunk.
Too, yeah.
There's that, but you also don't want them coming off the bus because then they're out in the public with the potential to get hurt. So that's interesting. Yeah, the Philadelphia fan base has always been one of the most unique. They're very passionate. I was going to tell this quote to Glenn Erby, but this was circulating around in anticipation of this game because there was a famous Mike Schmidt quote that was, Philadelphia is the only city where you can experience the thrill of victory and the agony of reading about it the next day. I feel like that's a good summary of Philadelphia fanhood there.
Yeah. Well, and just another reference, Billy Wagner is a good friend of mine who was a closer in the major leagues for a long time, played in Philadelphia, and he was telling me a story about how he got booed when he struck out someone when he played for Philly because he had thrown his first pitch at 101 or 100. He threw his second pitch at 100, and then he threw the third one at 99, and they booed him because he registered under 100 miles an hour and his own strikeout. And he was like, I've never experienced a fan base that would boo their own team for not doing as well as they expected you to do, but still winning the play.
He achieved what he needed to achieve on that play. Yes. He got the strikeout. What does it matter if he threw a pitch in the dirt and it was 80 miles per hour and it got a strikeout? It doesn't matter. That's funny. But that, I feel like that does epitomize the fan base and that team as a whole, because the team even is embodying that a little bit. We were talking about the culture versus talent thing, but Detroit, yeah, they've kind of trademarked the grit phrase, but Detroit is a gritty city. You played in all the markets, all the teams, all the areas, and I'm sure you saw the differences in the cities when you went there, and Detroit is naturally a gritty city, so the team tends to embody that, and when they're good, they're gritty. They wouldn't be able to compose a high-talent team like a Philadelphia and then deal with all those egos. That typically doesn't work for them, whereas Philadelphia, their fan base is a little bit more high anxiety, and so for whatever reason, then that ends up happening with these teams, because the Phillies are even that way now. They have a lot of talent, but you don't know what's going to happen on the field. It's just interesting how the culture of the city embodies the team and vice versa.
Well, and I think when you have a city that has the history that Detroit has, I think the coach knows, like, we need to embrace this. And sometimes you have, how do you tell your team in Vegas to be gritty, right? Like, you just, everything is glitz and glam and all that. It would be hard to do, but in Detroit, it's a very easy thing. I know that's something we tried to do in Cincinnati. Other places I've been, they play that card. And I think every city can probably try to tell you some part of their history when they had it tough and the city pulled together and 9/11 in New York and all those type of things. They try to pull from the culture of locality, but does the team buy into it? And I think the good coaches are the ones that know how to persuade players to buy into it. And one thing that I learned as a coach is that I have to create my ideas that I want the coach to buy into, almost like it's his idea, so that he came up with it, even though I thought about it. So that's what good coaches can do. And I'm not saying I was good, but that's something I learned from the other coaches is even your players. The good coaches can get their players to have so much conviction in it that they almost think it's their idea to do what they're going to do.
That's a life lesson right there, because I feel like that's true for a lot of people. They have to kind of think it's their own idea to embrace it sometimes. And that was a common theme for the Rust Belt teams and the Midwest teams. Cincinnati is kind of more in the Rust Belt, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. What do you got, Big G? You got something over there?
Yeah, I know we got to go to break real quick, but Shayne, what do you think? Do you think that Dan Campbell actually having played for Detroit had something to do with the fact that he wanted to make the players buy in? Look, I've been here. It's not as bad as what the media makes out. It's not as bad as what outsiders make it out to be. Do you think that has anything to do with that?
I think it absolutely does, because when we all want to take advice from someone, we all want to know that the advice we're taking is someone who experienced it and went through it. And, unfortunately, sometimes as children, we feel like our parents never went through it, but they did. But when it comes to respecting your coach and respecting the authority and what he's doing as far as decision making, I think knowing that he went through it and him being able to experience some downtimes and when things were really tough around here, I think the players can really identify with what he's saying. And I think that definitely gives him an advantage of being somewhat, local hometown type of entity that can say, guys, I sat in the seats you're in. I've gone through this. So let me tell you this or blah, blah, blah. I think that definitely gives him a lot more credibility.
he's got the right combination of strength and smarts to pull that off, in addition to his history, like you said, Shayne. So yeah, interesting discussion. We're going to bring Glenn Erby on after the break and talk some Eagles and get his perspective, because I'm curious what he sees as a writer too, because I have to imagine he hears, because the sports radio landscape and journalism landscape is a lot different in Philadelphia as a result of the fans there. So we're going to bring him on after the break. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. Happy to bring on this next guest here. Been in contact with him actually for a long time. I got in contact with him to prepare for the possible Lions-Eagles matchup that we never got. The Eagles roared to the Super Bowl and to the championship last year. The Lions, the injury issues got them, and they never got to match up with the Eagles. But now we've got a big marquee matchup in the NFC, and so I'm happy to welcome Glenn Erby of Eagles Wire and also Ravens Wire. So welcome to the show, Glenn.
Hey, how are you guys doing?
We're doing well. Yeah, Shayne and I were having a conversation about Philadelphia as a whole, because it has to be interesting to be a journalist in that market in particular, because this is one of the topics I wanted to discuss with the differences between the Lions and the Eagles. But it's an interesting fan base there. All the fan bases have their own identity, and they all have fans that are great representations of a fan in that market, and then maybe not so much. But Philadelphia, they've got an edge to them. So I'm curious if that kind of comes up, if you get a lot of feedback in that market there.
Certainly. I think some days it's like walking around in the twilight zone, because you'll hear fans, they're telling you, it's the media's fault. You guys are negative. You guys are these things. But then, the A.J. Brown stories and the A.J. Brown stories on Twitch and the A.J. Brown cryptic message, those are some of the most, read and talked about stories. So the fans feed the monster. Everything feeds the monster. You have a 7-2 team, a number 1 seed right now into week 11, but it feels like a twilight zone, and sometimes it feels like, the sky is cratering for the most part.
I feel like that summarizes it well, because having a couple radio shows here, I try to resist that urge, because I like to go to the next level, and Shayne and I are doing that on our show here, because it's like, yeah, that's easy to do, and some of it you do have to cover. It's like, yeah, that A.J. Brown story is a story. You got to cover it. That you didn't tell him to get on that Twitch stream and do that. It happened, and now you got to cover it. But yeah, then people are then swirling around about it, and you could still have an educated discussion about it, which is what we try to do on this show. But I'm curious about your thoughts on that issue as a whole, because Shayne and I were talking about this in the last segment. This does seem like a talent versus culture matchup. The Eagles, in my opinion, being in this market and biased, or not trying to be biased towards the Lions, I think the Eagles have the clear talent advantage, but they seem like a bit of a house of cards to me. Even when they were running to the Super Bowl last year, there's just not a lot of cohesiveness. And whether it's A.J. Brown or other factors, Sirianni isn't the same type of leader as Campbell. So I'm curious how you see all of this developing from your coverage of it.
I mean, I think that the teams are similar in somewhat. The Eagles march to the beat of the drum of their head coach. So from that standpoint, there is a culture there. But I think, like A.J. Brown said yesterday, it's evident, you have a team this explosive. You have a defending Super Bowl champion who leads the NFL in 3 and outs. That, that's unexplainable. Clearly, that's on the offensive system. That's on the offensive coordinator. Yeah, we can sit around all day and talk about the wide receiver. He's a 3-time All-Pro. He's been an All-Pro since the first day, he put on pads in Philadelphia. And, the conversation can be about, okay, well, is this Devontae Smith's time? Is this someone else's time? But clearly the offense is not clicking. Clearly in the offense, the chemistry is not there. The synergy is not there. So it's still something to talk about. But it's definitely a situation where there's a culture there, but there's been a drop-off in offensive line play and offensive efficiency and different things like that. And you have those discussions.
Shayne, you were talking about this a little bit in the last segment, how you kind of want to have people around where you can kind of implement and implant some ideas, whether you're an assistant coach or a player, and kind of get the coach to buy in, or whoever it is, the players to buy in. That's what I'm curious how you see the ecosystem of a team like the Eagles, because they do have an edgy coach, as Glenn was referring to, and then they have players that are kind of acting up, but it's like you need a leader to kind of step in, but it's also going around in a circle. So it's like, who stops the music in that circle of musical chairs and then gets everybody rerouted a different direction?
Yeah, it's the whole classic thing that everyone talks about. There's no I in team, and
right.
But yet someone else can say, but there's an I in win.
Correct.
You can get away with that sometimes, and I think that when you have players that are, like I talked about before, kind of on the bus, going the same direction, everyone's working together, you don't have that that individuality of someone who's more concerned about their stats, or more concerned about a roster bonus, or making it to the Pro Bowl, or whatever. Like the things that I remembered as a player, you'd see that sometimes. And while individual performances are great to help you and it helps your team, when that's all you're thinking about and you're not willing to be a sacrificial lamb on one play, that becomes an issue. And when you have guys that are all buying in, and someone realizes, hey, this isn't the look for me to get the ball, so I'm not going to try to convince my quarterback to get me the ball and force an interception possibly, when maybe it's meant for the number 2 receiver on that play, or whoever it might be. I've literally witnessed that and seen players like, I want the ball, and then they throw a tantrum when they don't get the ball. And it's like, well, you weren't really a great matchup on that coverage, or whatever the situation was, but the quarterback seemed pressured to throw it to you, so now he's throwing an interception because it really wasn't the right decision. And sometimes when you have a lot of that battling and call it egos, call it whatever, that can be a thing. I don't know that that's a huge issue in Philadelphia, but I know that can be a thing. And when you have guys that are all willing to jump on the grenade for each other, it becomes a whole different story.
Go ahead, Glenn.
Can I interrupt and ask Shayne a question?
Go ahead.
As a former player, you take into account, okay, they're 7-2, and it's about the team. But as a player, and in this day and age where we know player salaries, we know he makes $32 million a year. How does that impact his idea? Because if he catches 50 balls for 950 yards, is he still going to make that amount? I would like to know what you think in terms of, because that's what I sit here and think, like, okay, well, we understand it's about the team, but then we can also understand why he's snapping out. So as a former player, can we get your insight on that?
It's a very, very, very fine line, and also that line can be blurred a lot because, we don't know how long we're going to be able to play. We don't know how long we're going to have the same earning potential. So you want to, take as many big bites out of the apple as you can while you have the chance.
Okay.
I completely understand that, but I also think there's a way of going about it where you can take the role that is given to you, and you understand, like, if I show my bitterness, if I show my attitude that I am unhappy, and I present it to the world, that negative energy is toxic, and that negative energy is also it's like a disease that can spread way too easy, and when you present that negative body language, your teammates feed off that energy, and it's like, okay, well, then you make a mistake, and all you've been talking about is everybody else's mistakes, but now it's your mistake. How do you bite that? How do you eat that yourself? Is it your body language? Do you act like, okay, I got it, I got the next one, and everybody's pushing you along and helping you and pulling you along to get over that mistake? Or have you turned your back on everyone else with their mistakes, and now they're not supporting you when you make a mistake? So I think that positive energy that you try to bring just kind of brings everyone else with you. And that's kind of what we talk about when we talk about a vocal leader versus just a star leader. and not just being, all about your talent, but it's about how can I support the rest of my guys, because there's going to be a time when I need their support as well.
That's a great perspective. Okay, thank you so much.
That's a great question, Glenn. And it kind of makes me think of I feel like that discussion, while you guys were having it, makes me think of basically kind of Jameson Williams versus A.J. Brown this year. They're not the same talent or type of player, but they're handling their situation differently. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, Glenn, but J-Mo has not really gotten the amount of looks that I think he expected, and they expected with trying to have more verticality in the offense. And A.J. is obviously not happy either for maybe some of the reasons that you're highlighting, but they're handling it differently. J-Mo has not had a single complaint or cryptic tweet or anything, and now that energy that Shayne's talking about has kind of come back around, and Campbell took over the offensive play calling, and the ball's coming back to J-Mo. So it is an interesting discussion of, okay, are you going to try to stay positive and then will that into existence, or do the demands for the ball help, but then that's also going to then potentially have a negative effect on the team, as Shayne was saying?
Yeah, so you're making great points, because, I think I did an article last night. Brown only has between 4 and 6 less targets than Devontae Smith. So they're both as 1A and 1B. Unlike some other teams, they're still getting targeted. It doesn't happen the way he may want it to happen. It doesn't happen in the flow. It may not be as efficient, but it's not like, Devontae Smith has 64 targets and A.J. Brown has 30. They're like separated by 6, and that's including Dallas Goedert and Saquon Barkley. So that's why I wanted to know. It's a difficult dynamic. It's something to watch, and it could sometimes be confusing to figure out if he's right, if he's wrong, or if it's just the way things are going.
It is. It's where the buy-in is so important, because they have that both teams have a lot of mouths to feed, so to speak, with all those targets that they have and the running backs and everybody that they have going. So it's interesting to watch and see what develops. But I want to come back to that a little bit, because I want to talk about not only that breakdown, but also the 2023 draft, because I think that there was a connection between the Eagles and the Lions where there was different players picked, and that was related to culture as well. So I want to pick up with Glenn after the break. Stick with Shayne and I. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. I'm back here with Glenn Erby, giving us great stuff here. It's an interesting discussion about these two teams, because they are two of the favorites in the NFC to get to the NFC Championship and get to the Super Bowl. They're doing it different ways, and that's one of the subjects I want to take care of in this second part of the interview. But it makes me think of, when we're talking about this talent thing, I know that when the 2023 draft happened, the big player, I feel like the most discussed player in that draft to a degree, was Jalen Carter, because he's clearly very talented, and the Eagles have seen that. And I feel like a lot of teams and a lot of fan bases are going, well, wait a minute, why didn't we pick this guy? But there was a pretty clear reason why he was not picked. I think the Eagles were the perfect team to get him. If I'm the Eagles, I do go after him because of the Georgia connection, because he had mentors there and people that he had played with. And so I think that was a good fit. But I know that was a guy that the Lions were potentially interested in. But I remember a Dan Campbell quote at the time basically saying, hey, when you have a culture like ours, you can only have 1 or 2 of those guys. Otherwise, that becomes the culture. And Carter's been great. This is not a point about Carter. It's more about Brown and some of the other things. But that's the type of culture that I think of when I think of the Eagles, where like they're balancing it, but they're kind of right on that line.
Yeah, I would think so. I think it's not necessarily a negative or a positive energy, but you got a lot of guys who consider themselves, I guess, alpha males who consider themselves him. You have a Saquon Barkley, you have A.J. Brown, you have a Devontae Smith. Although he's quiet, he's a Heisman Trophy winner. He's the number 10 pick in the draft. He's someone. Hurts is someone who's been doubted. And as the second pick in the draft, he, was able to take the position from Carson Wentz. He's an MVP runner-up. He has his own personality. Guys on the offensive line have their own personality. You switch over to defense, you have Jalen Carter, you have Zach Bond, you have Quinyon Mitchell. There are a lot of big, heavy personalities on there, and Sirianni does a good job of letting those guys be themselves. But like I think, the owner said last week or 2 weeks ago, he likes to look at it as intensity and not necessarily adversity or controversy. So it's a culture. It's a culture they accept, and sometimes they walk the line and they teeter the line in terms of what some may feel acceptable and, what could crater a locker room they galvanize under.
That's a good point. One of the big differences I feel like between the Lions and the Eagles are, we talked about the coaching and the culture, but really the GMs are maybe the most opposed. They're they're both very successful, but they do it a very different way. Howie Roseman's known for being very aggressive there, and he's done it again. They traded for a cornerback. They traded for Jalen Phillips, who there was talk of in this market, and that's what a lot of I feel like the Detroit fans look at Philadelphia with a little bit of envy in that sense, because Holmes notoriously is not very aggressive, especially when it comes to the trade deadline and giving up assets. He'll make trades, but it's usually for late round picks and guys that he wants to repurpose and kind of get a better fit for in that Detroit culture. But Phillips is already showing early returns. I could see him showing the Lions what they're missing out on here on Sunday.
I think, Roseman has his share of misses. He'll get credit. He's credited as being the best GM. He takes a swing, but, he'll acquire some guys and they may not work out. But, he's done such a good job, since passing on Justin Jefferson and using his eyes, taking the eye test, not trying to get too creative. So he has his misses, but I think he gets complimented for, constantly trying to upgrade the roster. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And, Jalen Phillips could have a really good stretch run, and depending on what someone offers him in free agency, how we could let him walk, get a third-round pick, and be cool with it. So I think that, it's two different roster building processes, but they both work. But as long as the salary cap continues to expand and there's always more money on the table, those void years, won't catch up with the Eagles and Roseman's system of roster building.
Which that's the similarity that they have, because Holmes is putting a lot of money in the future, planning on those budgets going up and the revenues going up like they have. So that's the one similarity. Shayne, I'm curious of your thoughts on this, because you were obviously in a lot of NFL locker rooms. We're talking about this bus analogy and the talent versus culture, but that's always curious to me about the trade deadline, because you got everybody finally sitting where they're supposed to sit on the bus. And then halfway through the season, halfway through your trip on the bus, now somebody leaves, and then there's another guy that's supposed to take his seat, but that might not be his seat or where he wants to sit or where he needs to sit for the team. And you've got to adjust that organism that is in NFL locker room culture to that new guy or losing the one guy and then adding another guy.
So seeing this from a player's perspective, I never got traded. I never had to deal with it. But if you can just imagine thinking your life is going to be in a certain place for a certain time, and you've embedded yourself in the community, and you've, tried to feel that identity with that city, and all of a sudden you get traded with no notice, that's a tough thing to go through. So it's a challenge psychologically, I think. Even when you have a locker room full of guys that are friends with someone and they've created bonds on and off the field, and now all of a sudden that person's gone. And now there's this new face, and it's like, who the heck is this guy? And maybe they know who they are, but it's still a matter of now we have to not only embed them, but get them into the same culture, buy into the same things, but also the personal relationships you have. Getting past, were there any, cross-field rivalries? Were there any, spats or anything like that they ever had to deal with? And then, I'll just, Thursday night dinners, okay? I always went out to dinner when I was in Cincinnati with the D linemen, and they were a tight group. And in fact, my best friend to this day is one of those guys. And when me and Frosty and a lot of the other guys would all go out to dinner, when someone was cut or injured and out for the year, like, it took a toll on us, because that was one of your brothers. And now that guy's gone. And now there's this new guy, and we're like, well, he's not as funny, or he's not as, like you feel that, and you have to adjust, because you don't have a choice. Like,
right.
That's all you can do. And it's, how well do you handle the situation versus there's nothing you can do about it. You got to handle it the right way. And I'm lucky I never had to deal with it. None of my close friends ever had to deal with it. But I always saw it as like, man, what is it like to be that guy? The new guy or the guy that had to leave? Because you're both flip-flopping roles. You're now the new guy somewhere else, and this other guy is now the new guy. And his old teammates are like, man, we miss John or Chris or whoever. I see it from a personal side more so than a team football side, because I know that those relationships can be very dire as to the structure and camaraderie that you build your culture and you board the bus together type thing. That's the way I see it.
Well, you're playing a game for 3 hours a week. The rest of the time is obviously the majority, and we've been talking a lot about the off-the-field stuff here today. It makes me think of the Seinfeld bit where he talks about how you're rooting for laundry when you're rooting for a sports team, because it's like, no, different shirt. They're wearing a different shirt. No, we can't root for them anymore. And it's like there's still players underneath that. There's personalities to your point, Shayne. But Glenn, you were talking about that with the Eagles. I feel like the Eagles kind of get used to that to a degree. It is a little bit more of a transient culture there for that team because Roseman does have a tendency to make moves, and some players have stayed and they've been able to retain them, but there's different degrees of that. The other part that I want to get your opinion on, though, because there's been a lot of discussion of injuries, especially on the Lions side, but I know the Eagles have had some major injuries, so I was curious what you've seen from the injury reports here. It's nice to talk about this stuff on Thursday as opposed to Monday when I'm typically talking about it, because there's nothing coming out, but now we can see full practice, no practice, limited practice. I'm curious where you see guys like Lane Johnson trending for Sunday here.
He's going to play, but I think it's, that's the one thing when we sit and we talk about what they're not doing that they did last year and other things. And I feel like that, that's the one aspect that's left out is, that whether it be the Super Bowl run or the lack of, rest after the Super Bowl or whatnot, the offensive line, hasn't performed like the best offensive line, whether it be injury or attrition or Mekhi Becton moving on and Tyler Steen replacing them. That's been a sore spot. So I know, you had 3 or 4 guys, 3 or 4 starters popped up on the injury report. They're all going to play, but they're all banged up. So I think that, that's something to discuss, and that's something to monitor as well in terms of why Saquon Barkley isn't having, the explosive plays he isn't having, why sometimes Jalen Hurts doesn't have enough time to, connect with A.J. Brown. So all those things are all swirling in the gumbo, per se.
I like that phrase. Well, I feel it's funny to think of Lane Johnson, being a little bit injured, because I'm thinking of maybe the biggest offensive lineman rivalry we currently have in the NFL. I didn't even think of this, but I feel like Sewell and Johnson have gone back a little bit because they're clearly 2 of the top tackles in the NFL, right. And they're both a little beat up. So they might have a little rivalry game going here. So we'll have to see how they do, because obviously with both teams, as it's true with every NFL team, the offensive line drives everything on the offense. But I'm curious how you see this game going here, Glenn. We usually like to try to get a prediction from the opposing beat writers that are covering things for us and analyzing things for us. I can't imagine you see a blowout on either side, but what do you and I imagine you would pick the Eagles, but what do you see? How do you see this game playing out?
I mean, I think it'll be a close game. You have explosive players on both sides. You have, quarterbacks who are efficient, who don't like to turn the ball over. I think for me, my biggest worry is, the Eagles have 3 really talented linebackers, but will Zach Bond, will the rookie Jahai Campbell, Nakobe Dean, which one of those guys, when matched up on Jahmyr Gibbs man-to-man, are able to, to contain him? Or, what is Vic Fangio's recipe for not allowing Gibbs to go crazy in the passing game and the running game and become that ultimate dual threat? So I think in terms of, guys on the outside, both lines are good, both defenses are good, but I think that linebacker running back matchup between the Eagles defense and Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery will likely determine the game for me.
Interesting. That's an interesting one to highlight. I feel like most times people go to the receiver cornerback matchup, which the cornerbacks on the Lions defensive backfield as a whole they're a little dinged up. The Eagles have had some issues there. So, but I can see that on both sides, because obviously you got to watch Saquon Barkley from the linebacker level too. And even though he hasn't necessarily hit peak Saquon Saquon Barkley performance, it's still Saquon Barkley. You still got to look out for him. So, but we appreciate you joining the show, Glenn. Great stuff. Good conversation. We'll look forward to having Glenn back on here to review the game with us. But be sure to tell people where they can follow you, because you do Eagles Wire and Ravens Wire still, right, Glenn?
Correct. I'm the managing editor for the Ravens Wire at USA Today, Eagles Wire at USA Today. You can find me on X, Twitter at the Cover 2 NFL. And I just appreciate you guys having me on, and I look forward to coming on again. Thank you guys again.
Definitely. Hopefully we have a good game to talk about. Should be a good clash of the Titans in the NFC here, but we'll look forward to having you back on, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, guys. I feel like those two teams will definitely see each other again, so we'll certainly have this conversation at some point in January or February, but thank you again.
That's what I'm looking forward to. That's why I like doing this segment, because we've talked to a lot of teams that I feel like the Lions could see again, so hopefully we do that, because it's been a great conversation, but we'll talk to you next week here. Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate both of you guys. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Glenn. Thanks to Glenn Erby. Appreciate him joining us. That was a good interview here. He also does a great job covering the Ravens, too. We didn't talk to him before the Ravens game because we had Javen Hunter on. But yeah, I want to continue the conversation with Shayne after the break, because Glenn jumped in with a great question, but I have a guess of who Shayne was talking about that wanted the ball back in that day. So maybe he'll tell us, maybe he won't. The statute of limitations isn't up on some of this stuff, but we'll continue the conversation. I also want to talk some more Belichick here from last week. So stick with us. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. Coming back here with Shayne to finish out the show here for the last half hour. Like I said, Glenn had a great question, so I'm glad he jumped in. And Shayne's got so much great information, which we're going to try to extract from him throughout the show's tenure here. But when he was talking about how there were certain receivers that he played with that maybe wanted the ball more than others, there was a certain Spanish number combination that came to mind for me. My Spanish is a little rusty, but there's a certain Spanish number combination that came to mind. I didn't know if it was him or him and other people, or maybe not him. Maybe I'm not giving him enough credit here.
Well, it certainly wasn't an Irish combination. I'll try to neither deny nor confirm, but I think you're on the right path. There many times, I remember sitting in film and seeing the coach say, "Why are you raising your hand like this?" Like first off, really good receivers don't need to raise their hand. Now, what Chad was Chad had an ego. We all know that. He'll tell you himself.
Sure.
And he had a really good attitude as far as he wanted to make a difference. So I won't fault him for that, but I think when you get the whole I'm so good I can do everything on every single play, that's where you push the boundaries. And I think when when you're in a position where if you don't throw the ball, I'm going to get yelled at, I'm going to get a tantrum of some sort, that can sometimes create an issue. I think other receivers on the team might feel a certain way. I think the quarterback's going to feel a certain way, the OC, the head coach, all of those, you're kind of creating a ripple effect. And sometimes you're just not open. And what Chad was known for was he had amazing feet. Like, he ran routes better than anyone. And when he would do footwork drills, his feet could move so fast in such a short span of space, inside a box, creating space between him and other players, but you're not going to get that 100% of the time. Sometimes the defensive backs are going to have leverage on you. Sometimes they're going to have help. Sometimes you're just in a coverage that's just not meant for you, and no matter how good of a route runner you are, you have to learn to adapt. And that adapting is something that wasn't Chad's strong suit, because Chad could see a play, know his assignment, and follow the line on the play on the playbook. And he followed that line perfectly and did a great job of it. Where he ran into issues when he went to New England and played for Belichick is their offense was different. Tom made a lot of decisions based on the coverage, based on the leverage, and he could see it very early, and he was on the same page with those receivers, and they could see it, so they could break one way when the play maybe originally was meant to break the other way. So these hot routes or anytime where you're doing a different read where it might call for a slant instead of an out, or it might call for something different based on the leverage of the defensive back and the overall coverage of the defense. That's not something Chad did. Chad ran the play as it was designed, and he was really good at it. Whereas a lot of the receivers in New England made a name for themselves because they became really good because they had a quarterback that made sure they understood, all I've got to do is look at you, and I've looked over there, and I see that defensive back is playing 2 yards further back, or that defensive back is an inside leverage versus outside leverage, or whatever it may be, and that receiver knows that Tom knows that they know, and they trust each other, and they can make those decisions, and he's going to throw a pass, and a guy's going to literally turn his head and have a ball in his hands at the exact same time, whereas if you're not on the same page, you might throw the pass expecting a player to break a certain direction, and that player's running a whole different route than the quarterback's throwing to, and that's where you find the big issue, and that's why Chad never really had a ton of targets in New England, and never really was a factor on that team.
Well, that's an interesting distinction in multiple ways, because I'm thinking about kind of the different careers that these guys had, and because you saw that more when Tom was in Tampa. I feel like, since those guys didn't necessarily play in that same system, there was a lot of talented receivers that he played with, but you saw him throwing his hands up more because he was used to the guys that Belichick and Brady kind of popularized, these quick feet, undersized guys like Wes Welker and Julian Edelman, where they didn't necessarily have the burning speed or athleticism that Johnson did. But I feel like that's why the main guy that I think of when I think of elite New England receivers, and it's an interesting distinction that you're making that apparently was the difference. I never thought of this before having this conversation, but Chad Johnson, obviously super talented, ultra talented receiver. Randy Moss was also an ultra talented receiver, but he worked extremely well in New England, and it must have been because he was combining those elite athletic traits that him and Chad both had, but then with the ability to improvise a little bit more, read the coverage a little bit more, and kind of integrate that, because that's probably something he didn't get as much credit for, because he had Chris Carter when he was in Minnesota, and then Brady's throwing to him. But it's like, well, hey, he's got to be, if he's turning this athleticism into what he produced, he's got to be a pretty good route runner and decision maker too.
And it helps that Randy was very smart. Randy understood a lot of the concepts that they ran. But a really big factor is that Randy is fast and has a really long stride, and he's 6'6", and I'm pretty sure that whatever 6'6" is, that reach, his arms expanded past that reach. I don't know exactly what that was, but that gave him a very distinct advantage. That's why we call it to this day. Anytime a receiver catches a ball over top of a defensive back, we call it "you got mossed," because he was one of those guys that you could literally create a jump ball situation, and however many times out of 10 at a very high click, he's coming down with that ball.
He's amazing to me, the ability to adjust to both of those situations, because, I mean, you got to wonder what happened in between when he was playing for the Raiders, because he was an undervalued asset when he came over to New England, and I think it was like a 4th round pick or something that New England gave to get him, and a very atypical acquisition for Belichick, because he had Chad Johnson that he went after, but normally he had these undervalued receivers that he went after, the Wes Welkers, like I said, of the world, and repurposed them, because it's like he couldn't find the right, when he did go after an athletic receiver, it was hard for him to find the right fit sometimes.
Well, I think you throw the mix in of the perfect storm. I think that Belichick, an extreme mastermind of football knowledge, mixed with Tom Brady, just an over-the-top work ethic and just competitive desire. You throw those together, you get two guys that are obsessed over success. I think it just throws gasoline on a fire, and I think that's why they had so much success. I don't know that Tom Brady has the same success in New England without Belichick. And I don't know that Belichick has the same success without Tom Brady. I think their mixture just played into the perfect storm, and that's why they were able to bring so many other guys with them. And I mean, I played on that team for a year, and I saw it, and I saw, you know, the intense pressure we had every single day just walking into a meeting, knowing that Coach Belichick could ask us a question, and we better know the answer, or you're going to feel pretty stupid in front of the whole team. And I think everyone kind of kept that standard, but Tom helped create that standard as well. So it was just such a very fruitful relationship for them both.
Well, that's such a classic sports radio debate now. When Brady did leave and now Belichick is gone too, it was always, well, who's responsible? I think your answer is the most astute one, which you played with them, so it's the most valuable by far, which is, hey, they both played into this. That this is the result of those two together. But now I'm curious what you make of both of them kind of going off and doing different things. Brady's trying the broadcasting side of things. He also is in ownership, and that's a little dicey to do both of those at the same time. He's kind of trailblazing there in a lot of ways. And then you got Belichick. We referred to him last week, but he's in college. He's the 10th highest paid coach. And that's the one thing I wondered. He's clearly a great coach. There's nobody can question his coaching ability. But I did question a guy of his advanced age being able to relate to the current college landscape, which is more complicated than ever. Not only are the kids as young, it's also a very complicated landscape that he doesn't really have a lot of precedence in either.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think if you put him in college football 15 years ago, 10 years ago, probably still reaches a certain level of success. Who knows how high? Coach Saban is kind of modeled after him to a degree. And I think that those two are kind of hand in hand. There's a reason why Coach Saban kind of got out of it himself, I think. And I think that it's because that standard, old school, hard-nosed, super genius mind of football doesn't always outrule the younger culture, the younger, now with, transfer portal and NIL and all of those things, but also just the fact that you are older and you're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds instead of 22 to 40-year-olds. And there's a maturity level and a level of understanding how to relate that plays into it, a very high click, because you're talking about guys that frontal cortexes haven't even fully developed yet, and you're trying to make them be professional football players to a degree, and now you're throwing money into it, and you're having to worry about their behavior and having to worry about the decisions they're making, and then also commanding respect and commanding the follow my lead, buy into my system, when you're dealing with young players that I've got enough money, I don't need to worry about this already. And they're not mature enough to truly understand the big picture versus the short-term picture.
You hit on the next point that I was thinking. The leverage is so different now in college, because you've got the transfer portal combined with NIL, where you have the idea that these guys don't necessarily have the same. They're getting paid. They're getting millions of dollars, and so they don't necessarily have to listen to the coach the same way. And if they don't like what he's saying, they'll go to a different team that may pay them and find value in them. What are you thinking about this, Big G? You got a question here?
Well, I don't have a question, and I'm probably going to get a lot of hate mail for this, but just because Belichick's got a college-age girlfriend doesn't mean he understands college-age players.
I mean, somebody needed to say it, and it couldn't be Shayne.
It was the elephant in the room. I'm going to be honest with you. There are two things in this world that are undefeated, and he's fighting against both of them. One is time, and one is I'll just say females. I just don't think that the perception that we get as outsiders, it seems like she's controlling. It seems like she's very inserted into this college coach, like she's trying to get the guys to change how they do their PowerPoints. She's trying to, she's interrupting interviews. Like Like, you just don't see that. And it's something that, for me, knowing Bill the way I know Bill, it's just like, who is this guy? You know, and he hated social media, and he purposely would say them wrong just to make a point. And now he's posting pictures, you know, doing whatever, and it's cute and all that, but come on.
That's exactly what I was thinking. This is a guy that notoriously had such control over that organization. He was basically the general manager. He was the coach. We talked about kind of the coaching tree not necessarily bearing a lot of fruit because he was under such control, him and Brady. But the idea that he's the last guy that I would think of all these guys would be with, because they're both adults. We don't have to judge that part of it.
Sure.
But it's like him. He doesn't seem like a great fit with a younger girlfriend, given his ability to being his age, being a little bit more advanced, and then being under control. He's ceding a lot of control to the new person in his life here.
It seems as such, and you know, he's a guy that has an unbelievable knowledge of football. I mean, this guy, you could bring up something completely random, and he will tell you a story and break down so much about that story that probably could go back to the Naval Academy in such and such year or whatever, and just have incredible knowledge. Funny story, our punter was a rookie the year I played there. His name was Zoltan Mesko, University of Michigan. Okay. We had just watched the game where the Giants punted to Deshaun
Jackson. Okay.
And it was supposed to go out of bounds. And he shanked it, and it went to the middle of the field. It bounced once. The coverage was all screwed up, spread out. He picks it up off the bounce, runs it in for a touchdown. They win the game. Okay? We go over our situations again that week, and it's, okay, we're kicking this out of bounds. We're not hitting, maybe we're playing Chicago and didn't want to punt it to Devin Hester. I don't remember what the situation was. But the point of this play in practice was to punt it out of bounds. Zoltan punishes this ball, crushes it. Julian Edelman catches it a yard inside the sideline. The special teams coach didn't know it didn't go out of bounds. He's like, great punt, great punt. So Zoltan thinks he did a great job. Bill Belichick comes running down the field, cussing and screaming. Zoltan's like, what? It was a good kick. I wish I could say the things he said.
Yeah.
But what he did is he walked up, and I was right there, and he took his whistle off his neck, and he says, do you want to coach this football team? Zoltan, I just looked at him and said, Zoltan, shut up, don't say anything. And he didn't say anything. And he said, I forgot more football yesterday than you've learned in your whole life. And it was just one of those moments that you just never forget. And it's like, you know, he's actually probably right. But that's how much knowledge the guy has. I mean, it is tremendous. And to see and hear him still talk football, he's still going to be sharp on it. But there's a lot of coaches out there that know a lot of football that if they can't relate to the players, if they can't create a sense of trust, a sense of, you know, the one thing I loved about my college head coach, Frank Beamer, who was an older coach, was that he came across like a father. And you did not want to disappoint your father, but you also knew, like, I want to do what's right for me. I want to do good things. I want to shine and all this, but also Dad told us what to do, and we got to do it right. And if I don't do it right, I'm going to feel bad about that. And that's how I felt with my dad. Like when I knew I upset my dad, I would almost get upset because I'm like, man, I let him down. And that's how we felt with Coach Beamer, is we didn't want to let that guy down. And if you can't create that dynamic with younger players in college, it's really hard. And I don't know how well he's going to do that when there might be guys on there that are like, man, she's younger than my girlfriend, you know, like that type of situation, and then just take her out of the picture. It still could be a challenge.
With a parent, it's often worse when they're disappointed rather than angry at you. That's a big move there.
The disappointment is even bigger and a stronger emotion than the anger. Exactly.
What do you got, Big G?
Well, talking about Belichick's knowledge, look who he was defensive coordinator for, Bill Parcells.
Yeah.
You know, Belichick was on the field for Super Bowl 25 and quite possibly 21 when they won the Super Bowl. Of course, 25 being the wide right by Scott Norwood. Buffalo fans still call him Scott No Good, but Yeah, but the amount of knowledge between those two guys is insane.
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, and growing up as a kid, his dad was a coach as well. So he's been exposed to it at a high level his whole life.
Mm-hmm. And Bill Parcells, another taskmaster, very much like Bill Belichick. So the apple doesn't fall from the proverbial coaching tree. So that's where Belichick learned it. And, you know, you're absolutely right. I feel like I know quite a bit about football, but I guarantee you I know less than 1% of what Bill Belichick knows. And that's insane.
It is.
And he learned from the right folks, like you said. I can't imagine Bill Parcells coaching college, but by the way, that would be crazy to have. He could barely talk to the Mannings on the Manning cast last time I saw him. But yeah, interesting discussion on Belichick here. We got to take a quick break, but we'll come back and close up the show with Shayne. You're listening to Shayne Graham's Extra Points on Jethro FM. There's some symphonic metal for you, by the way, with a little quote that Shayne was doing as we were coming back from break here. But yeah, it's been a good show. We want to thank our sponsors here: Encore Business Group, Eric Hall Aesthetic and General Dentistry, Williams Chiropractic, Elite Winning Solutions, and Sal's Complete Home Painting and Handyman Services. I'm sure we'll deal more with Elite Winning Solutions as we go on here, because Shayne's got his branded sweatshirt on, and it'll be fun to talk, because this first show in studio, I think, is a good example of kind of what we wanted to do with the show, because we got some good interviews from analysts. We're glad that Glenn Erby and John Whiticar could join us, but Shayne's showing his wide base of knowledge. You might have been a specialist, quote unquote, on the field, but you experienced everything. You were an NFL football player. You weren't just a kicker. You were a football player.
You know, it's funny. I've got, you know, I'm the shortest by inches with my wife's family. My wife is an inch taller than I am. Her brother's 6'6". Her cousins are all 6'4", 6'5", 6'7". They're all super tall. And, you know, so I'll come around. I'm a little older than they are, but they see me as this smaller guy who was the kicker, you know, and they're like, oh, he played football. But you were just the kicker, so it doesn't count. And I've always kind of had that, and it never really bothers me. But that's also one of those things where I can say, well, I might have just been a kicker, but how many NFL tackles did you have? and I can always throw that at them. But, you know, that was the thing. When I was a player, I went to every meeting I could go to and took as many notes as I could. And I just absorbed as much as I could, and I loved it. And that's why I wanted to be a coach when I first got out and got into that world. I shared an office with Paul Pasqualoni at University of Florida. Yeah. And I can tell you, we had so many conversations about football, and I learned so much with him that, you know, I try to retain as much as I can, and I'll never know anywhere near what he has, just like with Belichick. But it's just a game that I love. So when we get to talk about it, it is just a blessing to be able to even just talk about it.
Oh, definitely. There's so much nuance to it, and that's why we wanted to do this show, because we like talking about the nuances of it. You can always overanalyze something or say, hey, why did you miss that kick, or why did you miss that catch? There's a lot more that goes into it. I did think of you, though, as kind of the final thing. I did think of you because you're talking about getting a lot of comments, being just a kicker, quote unquote. The long snapper is even more anonymous. Yeah. And I saw that Hogan Hatton almost got attacked on the Lions sideline. I don't know if you saw that video, but a guy climbed over. He was going back and forth with Hogan, because he's in kind of generally the same spot that you are there on the side. Yeah. Sure. And Hogan's a lineman, so he's a little bit bigger, but a guy actually came over the barrier in that Washington game, and the security had to rush him. And I thought, is this the first ever long snapper fight with a fan?
It's got to be. I mean, honestly, long snappers all have a very similar temperament. They're typically very docile, typically very quiet. You know, they probably played tight end or linebacker at some point in their career. That's their body type. But they're very to themselves, because they live in an upside down world, right? Like, they're upside down. They're flipping the ball between their legs. They've got one skill that they have to do, but then they have to understand the intricacies of punt protection and being solid when you've got 600 to 700 pounds crushing each side of your A-gap. You've got to have a little bit of calmness to you. So that's an interesting thing. I would love to see the video of that. I've not seen it yet, but there's one phrase that sticks out with when you said the anonymity of a player. Everyone always says, if no one knows who you are and you're a long snapper, it's a good thing, because the only time they ever know who you are is if you screw up.
That's a good point. I like to highlight all the players on the team because Don Malbach was a infamous long snapper here for the Lions, and now Hogan's taken over, and he's a good athletic guy, and like you said, has a lot of experience. But yeah, interesting conversation. We're going to pick it up here next week. Be sure to tune in to the whole Jethro lineup. We got Sports Project from 10 to 12 on Saturday, and 7 to 9 on Wednesday. You're going to see Big G on Wednesday there. Got Sports Intel from 7 to 9 on Monday. And then tune in to us here next week, 7 to 9 on Thursday. So kick it with Shayne and I next week. Until then, have a good week.